I'm very, very happy to introduce Rozena Maart. She is a professor from the University of KwaZulu in Durban, South Africa. She is very closely related to Bremen. She is a research ambassador of the University of Bremen. She is a social scientist, and she is doing a lot of research on race and identity. And she's not only a scientist, she's also a novelist. She wrote a novel which was very successful in South Africa. And once, when she was a young woman, she was active in the Black feminist organization Women Against Oppression. It was even during apartheid time, and at that time she was nominated as Woman of the Year in South Africa. And I'm very, really pleased to have you here, Rozena. Very warm welcome to you, and now it's yours.
Thank you, Christoph. And thanks to everybody for tuning in and participating in this event today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, but I've asked Christoph to play a 4-minute video just at the start of the presentation. If that's all right, Christoph.
Yes, I can do that. I have to share my screen and I can do that. This one here.
There's been a long drought. The food crisis is deepening. Why? Is this just unpredictable Mother Nature's doing, or are there other forces at play? The hidden story behind hunger, why we need food sovereignty and climate justice. In South Africa today, a fatal crisis is plaguing the land. Millions are suffering from it. Not only is it making survival difficult, it is ruining lives, destroying families, fragmenting communities, and crippling local economies. We're not talking about HIV/AIDS, or TB, or diabetes, or hypertension. We're talking about hunger. Hunger and its close relation, malnutrition. In a country that is abundant in resources, with great mineral wealth, modern cities, and fantastic tourism potential, over 50% of the nation's men, women, and children are food insecure. Who or what is to blame? Some blame it on the drought, some blame it on the El Niño climate cycle, some blame it on climate change. Some blame it on the government, some blame it on corruption, and some blame it on apartheid. These factors are all to blame, to be sure, but there's an elephant in the room. The truth is, we have been forced into an unsustainable, globalized, and coal-driven economic system that cannot feed and sustain the nation. The guardians of this corrupted system, a coal-driven minerals energy complex, and a rapacious cluster of globalized food corporations supported by the state, contribute directly to this country's climate, energy, and food crises. But South Africa is not alone in its food crisis. Globally, the loss of land, biodiversity, oceans, and forests is hitting the poor hard. How did this happen? Let's go back 200 years or so to the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe. Powered by new coal-fired technologies fueling their furnaces and factories, the capitalist economies of the global north spread their tentacles across the world. By the 20th century, 7 Western oil corporations controlled the global oil supply. Today, despite global warming, these corporations are still extracting oil through fracking, tar sands, deep-sea drilling, and a new scramble for Africa's oil. And here we are today, about 200 years later, in the post-colonial, post-apartheid, post-Fordist industrial age, bang in the middle of a planetary crisis. Capitalism is a key cause of deforestation, carbon emissions, and global warming, as corporations continue to pursue growth and profit above all else. For the last 20 or more years, the annual COP meetings of the UN have affirmed the interests of rich countries and corporations. Market solutions, techno-fixes, and voluntary commitments are not addressing the climate challenge. We need a new paradigm for a transformative, just transition. Let's think again about the web of life. Let's appreciate the interdependence we have with nature and build grassroots power for system change. Pioneered by La Via Campesina, the international small-scale farmer movement, food sovereignty is now an international campaign. Strengthened by international solidarity, the food sovereignty movement has the potential to challenge profit-driven food corporations and democratize the global food economy so we can adapt our food systems to climate change. Under the banner of SAFSI, an alliance of farmer groups, unions, organizations, and communities, we are fighting for a food sovereignty pathway and system. COPAC, like many others, supports the SAFSI and the solidarity economy. Together, we can build a red-green alliance for a just transition now to sustain life.
So first of all, I just want to say that I don't know most people. I've got the window open. I'm sorry for people who live in cold countries, but it is extremely hot here, so I have to say that. So I have the window open, and it's very hot here. So I'm from the Cape. I'm from Cape Town. I'm from a district called District 6, which is the old previously enslaved community of Cape Town. And my interest in this topic began with several reasons. Sorry, I'm just going to be a little distracted as I try to just attach this for Christoph. I teach in gender studies. My background is in political philosophy and psychoanalysis, so I do Black consciousness, critical race theory, gender. Those are the kinds of things that I teach. And I became interested in this topic in the last couple of years, but it gave me a lot to think about because my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, was a fisherman, and in starting in the 1970s and the 1980s, the government at that stage, the apartheid government, they just prohibited individual like fishermen from sea towns and communities from fishing. They basically had to, I'm just attaching this now, they had to basically work for a company called Irvin and Johnson, which was government funded. And that really stopped the work, it affected the livelihood of many people from small communities. Okay, I'm trying to see, okay, there it is. It's just going to be 1 minute, Christoph, and then you'll have it. I'm going to get my...
Great.
You've got it, Christoph. It's sent to you.
Not yet,
so
but...
yeah, I'll open it here on my side so I can start to talk already. And like I said, folks, it's very hot here on my side.
And it's a long way from South Africa to here. Now it's coming. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is where my interest began, really. As a child, I basically saw my grandfather's trauma when he wasn't allowed to work as a fisherman any longer. And also, I think for me, there are other issues that have emerged in the process. I also lived in Canada. I moved back to South Africa full-time, where I teach at the University of KwaZulu-Natal since 2000 and 2011, 2011, yes. So I am also interested in looking at ways in which the whole question of the environment and its linkages to gender and decolonization. So many of you are aware that South Africa is often called the cradle of civilization, and many remains of human civilization has been found in South Africa and the surrounding region. And at the same time, I think that what has always made it really difficult and a conflicting area to be involved in as either a scholar or activist is the fact that I think there's very little responsibility in South Africa taken by our colonials who still live in the same country, even though we are in the process of decolonization. And so climate justice and fighting for climate change has become a pillar for many to not involve themselves in taking responsibility for the injustices of racism and colonialism. So it's something that for me, as somebody who comes from a very particular historical community in South Africa, it is something that one enters with great trepidation, because you are aware that, and I think this has also been a discussion worldwide. Why is it that you still find this discrepancy where we see a lot of white folks involved in environmental and and environmental justice and climate justice movements? And why don't we see as many Black people? And that is not because Black people are not interested in climate justice. One, it speaks to the way in which white privilege speaks in all spheres of organization and taking up leadership positions in those organizations. And two, it always seems like vulnerable people and people from Black and oppressed communities are always saddled with a problem. It affects people more directly and more personally. So those are some of the things that I want to talk about. So can I have the next slide, please? Christoph, I guess you'd have to manage that for me. Thank you. So I'll talk mainly about those kinds of, the video that you just saw comes, the South African Food Sovereign Campaign. The body is quite making a lot of impact in South Africa. And I'll show you some photos of young protesters in South Africa, especially following the June 2019 and now again the September 2020 meeting. Just how widespread the interest is and the kind of work that is being done. So let me just look a little bit at the Climate Justice Coalition, a coalition of South African trade unions, civil society, grassroots and community-based organizations. Now, some of you will notice that these are exactly the organizations that were basically spearheaded the anti-apartheid movement, the national liberation struggle, so to speak, in South Africa. It's exactly the same kinds of organizations. So these are some of the objectives. If we are to overcome the power of polluters and politicians blocking action on climate justice, it is going to take all of us fighting together. That is why the Climate Justice Coalition is coming together to build a deeper, stronger, and more powerful movement. Together, we are working on advancing a transformative climate justice agenda, which works to tackle the inequality, poverty, and unemployment that pervades South Africa. We are advocating for a vision of climate justice, which advances environmental, energy, gender, racial, immigrant, climate, and economic justice together. So just a little bit of history for those folks who are perhaps not as acutely aware as others. When we talk about, for example, environmental, racial, immigrant, climate, and economic justice together, South Africa went through a period of transition shortly after Mandela became the first president. That was 1994. At that stage, there were already discussions around policies for transformation from an apartheid government to what is called in the documents of South Africa, non-racialism. And that's a whole, whether we say anti-racism or non-racialism, there's a big divide. But more so, one of the reasons I want to raise this point about why energy and gender and immigrant and economic justice is placed together, they are still to this very day communities living in absolute poverty, who are from communities where there's been forced removal. We were forcibly removed when I was 11 and a half from District 6. There are also communities in South Africa where you see migrant communities, but these are actually people of indigenous South African background, but they are constantly being moved around, have been historically moved around for the past almost 400 years, and that hasn't stopped. So that's one thing I want to make a point about saying. And also, there has been no justice done in terms of around the land or equitable distribution of the land. So I think one of the key elements of decolonization, certainly for indigenous people in North and South America, is that we cannot talk about climate justice if we don't talk about the land. And likewise, I think scholars of decolonization and climate justice will say, we cannot talk about decolonization without discussing questions of the land. So yes, I will try and tie some of this together as much as I can. Then my next slide is just a little bit, just go to the previous one, please. Yes, so this is Women for Climate Justice. It's a non-governmental organization registered in South Africa from 2010, working with women, gender activists, civil society organizations, and gender experts from the Southern African region, working for women's rights, gender equality and climate justice. I think most of you are familiar with Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan scholar, activist, won the Nobel Prize as well, whose work has influenced people across the regions in Southern Africa, and I would say for most part of the African continent. I raise this here because I want to be very clear in my particular critique of where I see gender playing a role and why it plays a role. For me, there is not an issue of white women in South Africa being vulnerable and somehow would be victims of climate justice. And I say this absolutely with the intention of also looking at how white women were participants, beneficiaries, and agents of the apartheid state and regime. They participated in apartheid. How else could it last for so long? In the same way they participated in coloniality. So what I'm talking about, my critique here in terms of gender equality and gender inequality is very much about women who are oppressed by a system of white domination and capitalist domination, and also women who are oppressed by an overwhelming historical operation and functioning of coloniality and racism. So we all know that in most Southern African countries, women do more of the housework, as well as women participate in collecting food items, preparing food, making sure that children are fed. And that kind of discrepancy hasn't ended in South Africa either, whether we have what we call a democracy or not. So I want to be very clear in what is understood here around gender and its relationship to climate justice. I do not speak for the Women for Climate Justice from Southern Africa. I'm offering my position and my critique, which comes from a history of my own work and my input in the country around critical race theory and decolonization. Okay, next slide, please. So this is from that particular website where there's a lot of information about how agriculture and the way that the drought, insufficient rainfall, land that is still hasn't been equitably distributed, the way that women work on the land in most Southern African countries, and the creation and distribution of food by women in these Southern African countries who are part of this particular coalition. So that's just from that website. Next slide, please. Next, okay. So I've already tried to address that. This is just from their position, and I'll try to elaborate as much as I can. Gender in South Africa still remains this relationship between boys, men, girls, and women. And I would add to this, this is as much an issue for transgender and cisgender people in our country. It involves the roles and responsibilities that are allocated to women and men, such as childcare for women and being the breadwinner for men. This is still the situation in the country, and yet women in most rural areas, in most rural towns across the Southern African region are still seen as being responsible, having to find the solutions for equitable climate justice. Women may be effective agents of change, both for mitigation and adaptation. Women have a strong body of knowledge and expertise that can be used in climate change mitigation, disaster reduction, and adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about South Africa's current climate justice charter. So this is where we are now. It emerged out of 6 years of campaigning during the worst drought in South Africa's history. For those of you who may or may not have heard of what happened in Cape Town in the last 3 years, we haven't had drought there this year, but there's been severe drought. I'm from Cape Town. I live in Durban. I've been living in Durban for almost 10 years now. So during the worst in South Africa's history by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, it has been informed by grassroots input from water-stressed communities, the media, labor, faith-based communities, youth, climate scientists, academics, women's organizations, environmental and social justice organizations. A climate conference was held in November 2019, consolidated a draft, which was then placed online for public comment, and a final round was then drafted for the Climate Justice Assembly, which was held this year in June 2020. Now, I just want to take us a moment to give some of you a little bit of kind of geography of apartheid, so to speak. When throughout, from 1652 onwards, when Van Riebeeck first sailed into the Cape uninvited, you will find that the majority of the white population in South Africa, who right up until 1994 owned 87% of the wealth, even though they were only 11 to 12% of the population. Now, you'll ask yourself, why does the current situation affect more Black people than white folks in South Africa? And that is directly related to processes and strategies of colonization, which land was given to white folks. And we find that a big population lives in Cape Town and of course in Durban and Johannesburg and major cities that are not as affected as people who were banished to places where nothing grows. And this is predominantly in the Eastern Cape, predominantly among the Xhosa community. And this is not something that is new. This is something that has been present in South Africa for a very, very long time. This kind of awareness and the fact that in many, many communities, the discussion around climate justice by far surpassed the 1994 mark. This has been going on. The kind of activism that we see in small towns hasn't reached the national or international media, but it has been something that has been very, very present. Next slide, please. These were some of the protests following the 2019 meeting. We can go to the next one. Next slide, please. Teenagers are activists in the fight for climate justice. Young people protesting, you'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. So before 1994, the face of environmentalism at the time, the phrase was used, was very much, oh, it's about the youth, the white youth. That is no longer the case in South Africa. And I think the whole question of environmental politics was always sort of assigned this idea that Black people worry about food that we're going to eat or where we're going to live or day-to-day bread and butter issues. and white privileged people worry about the environment. That is no longer the case at all in South Africa. We have a younger generation called Freedom's Children who were born either just before or post 1994, which is still declared Freedom Day, 27th of April, 1994. And the way that this kind of activism and awareness has worked, basically from elementary, primary to high school. And I think some of you have also seen what happened in Marikana, which is the Lonmin mining community, and the massacre that took place there in 2012. And the activism that emerged from there were mainly wives, partners, women in the area, basically talking about the exploitation of mine workers and, you know, the generation of capital that is still based on the labor, because the supply and demand issues around diamonds for the North that still comes from South Africa, the fantasies of these advertisements around, you know, getting engaged, getting married, having a big diamond on your finger. These fantasies are, you know, have to in some way, you know, be supplied with, and that comes from our country as well. Yes, so we can go to the next slide. This is from this year's, as you can see, these are mainly students. I think this may have been in Canada, but we have lots of protests like this in South Africa as well. This particular slide, I think, came from Canada. We can go to the next one. So I just want to look at a few elements here of why Southern Africa is more vulnerable for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with some of these discussions. Southern Africa will be exposed to comparatively stronger climate change. The Southern African interior has warmed at about twice the rate of global warming over the last 5 decades, and the climate models suggest that this pattern of above average regional warming will continue for the rest of the century. Secondly, it lacks coping capacity. Southern Africa is made up of developing countries which do not have very sophisticated disaster management systems and infrastructure, unlike in the North, nor money to spend on climate adaptation, and our economies are very sensitive to changes in the climate. This is not only agriculture and tourism industries, but in particular. Thirdly, Southern Africa is a dry and warmer region that is not only projected to become drastically warmer, but also drier, as we have seen in South Africa in the last few years. I will also send information and the sources where I have chosen to highlight some of the material today for those who are interested. We can go to the next one. So the question I think that we all have is, what is our responsibility? I think that, first of all, we need to take responsibility for the atrocities that have happened in the world already. Whether we are Black or white or Asian, we have to in some way also address our complicity in the way that we have participated in the very systems that have created the phenomena, the climate environment that we live in. And none of us should make excuses for any of this, which means that our agency, our ability to use our voices, our bodies as fleshed bodies to protest, to be disseminators of change, disseminators of transformation, to push for lobbying of policies, to ensure that practices at the early level of schools, as much as we can, as well as in communities wherever we live. And our position is always that the local, you start where you are, you start where you live. You don't go and use the mentality of the missionary and go and tell people in other communities how they should take responsibility. We all start where we are. I'm taking this particular segment from the South African Sovereign Group. Responses to climate change include both mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation and adaptation pathways are not politically neutral. They have to be about transformation in the personal, the practical, and political spheres of our lives. The focus is on changing the design of practices that are fundamentally making us vulnerable to climate risks in the first place. Examples of transformation may include transitioning to socially and community-owned renewable energy, enhanced access to climate jobs, and building a new food system based on food sovereignty system. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, next one. This is from something totally different. Okay, so we also have a climate justice charter in South Africa. I will try to highlight some of the points. Here we're talking about living together and the beauty of the continent, and also where our ancestry began. Now, I think for some of you, you know, looking at a new generation talking about being extinct, for some people might be far-fetched. Certainly for me, that is not far-fetched at all. I think that when we think about the African continent and we think about Southern Africa in particular, we have a lot of evidence to trace our ancestry. And I think the next generation will not have that to their advantage. We need more climate shocks and ecological crises. More climate shocks and ecological crises will result in more suffering. And we also know that this is not just about a pandemic that we've seen, but we've also seen the effect, the effects of climate change in communities. And we're talking about shantytown communities. We're talking about communities that are always in transition. And what does it mean to live through a crisis and have social distancing when people live in shanties that are actually 1 meter or 2 meters long? So if we look at also the deaths and the death toll in South Africa for COVID-19, we also see a complete disparity. Poor people die at a much higher rate because the resources are not available. We can go to the next slide. These are some of the goals of the Charter to advance an awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet. Earth is a common home for all species. Thus, we speak to affirm our role and responsibilities as guardians of our planet's ecosystems and the delicate web of life it supports, to inspire a break with the thinking that caused the crisis and that reinforces the obsession with growth, progress, and domination. The power of humanity is constrained by the limits, cycles, tipping points, and boundaries of all ecosystems. Next slide, please. I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to try and just wrap up. I can send and do some adaptation here to my PowerPoint. I think the most important thing I would like to say in closing is that as a country, South Africa has had a long history of finding ways to address its situation. Whether this has been around water, whether this has been around drought, different wide-ranging aspects of climate change, as well as looking at how rural communities who have been directly affected by colonization survived, 400 years. We had various communities, pre-colonial times, I don't use that word very lightly, that lived in many parts along the coast. Similar would be what Californians call beachcombers, people who had lifestyles and livelihoods where there was clearly an abundance. And that abundance is no longer there to feed those communities nor their families. One of the things I always tell my students is don't only look to the Berlin Conference, don't only look to 1884, look before that, because Africa was never poor. You don't go and rob poor people. The European colonizers came to the African continent, and particularly to South Africa, because we were rich. And those minerals and those resources have been depleted because the North is still obsessed with greed and power. And if it's not only greed and power with colonization, it remains to be greed and power for still trying to see themselves as the champions of the climate justice movement. So those are some of the things I think I wanted to share, and I'll be happy to take questions. I am sure I cannot answer all of them, but I will be able to send references and other materials for those who are interested. Thank you very much.
Great, many thanks, Rozena. I think that was a very strong statement, and I think particularly that you made all these links to the colonization. I think that was very important to see that's an issue as well, still in, let's say, an issue which affects our reality today. And yeah, for the moment, I don't see immediately a question, but what I wanted to ask is perhaps to pick up something which somebody mentioned at the very beginning, what can be done on the local level. And I was really astonished how strongly you focused on this, saying you start where you live. And is that more important than, for example, international contracts, for example, or treaties?
Look, my attitude is we can create, we can legislate for and against almost anything, but we can't legislate attitude. I mean, this is one of the things that I say in terms of South Africa's history of race and the problems that we still face today. I think international policies and laws are important. Yes, I do that. I do think so. But I think that we have to address the tendency that the North still has, the preoccupation with the North that still sees themselves as saviors. It's not that local people don't know how to address the situation. They were left with the situation. This colonization was not just about extracting and taking it back to Europe. No, it was about ensuring the destruction and making sure that those communities were not able to function. I mean, it was expected that those communities would die and their livelihoods and lives didn't mean anything. And so my position about starting where you are locally, I grow stuff in my own garden. And I do that because I think it's important. I want to see my ability to also be reliant on my own thoughts and ideas and my own actions. And what I'm saying is that too often we see this preoccupation with international activists and scholars to kind of go internationally and preach to the masses how to save a planet that they themselves, the masses, the non-masses from the North created. So I think my concern is not that we do away with international law, international policies. My concern is with agency. What kind of ethical responsibility do we take wherever we are in the world to recognize our complicity in creating a system that we are not going to benefit from? Nobody's going to benefit from. But we have to take that responsibility. In terms of scholarship and activism, we need to be able to talk to, whether you have kids or not, children in your community, nursery schools, playgroups, villages, wherever you are. Because the problem of climate change is it doesn't only affect wealthy communities, it affects all communities. It is something that is now on our doorstep, and it's going to flood our doorstep, or it's going to dry out our doorstep completely. So we have to start where we are. There's too much of the Northern mentality is to go to other places to try and save them. No, the planet is our responsibility. If we save the planet, we start where we are. We have to get away from this missionary mentality of going to save the poor people. The poor people are poor precisely because of greed, precisely because of European interest in extracting diamonds and all of the other resources that come with it. I think it's important that we build awareness where we are, that we mobilize, that we participate in all aspects of whatever we do, whether you're a teacher, a farmer, a laborer, all across. That is what we do. That is what awareness is about, and that is what's going to bring about the global change that we believe is necessary.
Thanks, Rozena. I think it's really great that you have this strong ethical stance, and I think our audience also appreciating that you have a lot of clapping hands and also written comments saying thanks to you. And I want to raise one more question. It's from somebody from Africa. He asks, how is South Africa pushing this climate action across the SADC region? I think that's a southern, South, not only South Africa, but southern
Yes, yeah.
region.
I know for a fact that, there was a Durban meeting here, I think in 2006. And I think this is being pushed quite severely. This is not only something that South Africa, again, and I have to say, as a South African, I'm also aware that our country, our leadership, the way that we have seen ourselves as the leader of Southern Africa is also highly problematic. So I'm not without taking recognition of what South Africa has also done as seeing itself as the leader of Southern Africa, or one of the leaders of Africa. This is hugely problematic. What I can do is I can send the documentation to you, Christoph, and whoever wants to have the information or whatever can share it, so that the question is addressed, but also the information is there for further perusal and consideration. Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. That's great. And we see you are suffering also from the heat. And yes, what impressed me as well is that you have already a climate justice charter in South Africa. I don't think so that we have it in Germany. And so great contribution was another statement here from one of our attendees. I would like to thank you, Rozena, and as far as understood, you will stay with us. And
yes, of course.
I would.
Hey, Christoph.
Yes, I will stay. Yes, of course.
Good afternoon. I'm Hubert, student of MES, IGC. Please, I have a few questions for the speaker.
Yeah. Let's say we have 5 more minutes. I just to interfere because we Dr. Prasad Modak from India, he is already 4.5 hours ahead, so she hasn't so much time. So we have, I would say, give you some questions, and Rozena have 5 minutes to answer, and then.
I'm also happy to give my email if there are other questions and we're running late. I'm happy to do that as well. Yeah. Not a problem.
Yeah. Perhaps one question.
Yeah. Sorry for the heat. I see the heat in South Africa is killing. My question goes with respect to the SADC region. I'm particularly interested about the SADC region. I'm from Africa, and just to say, I'm from Central Africa, so we suffer directly from the desert, out there. So the Kalahari Desert is not encroaching into the SADC region as much as the desert from Egypt getting into us. So how do the SADC region have managed to get through the climate, or South Africa has managed to get through this climate justice documents, and what impact will it have for countries like Namibia that shares water resources and every other resources with South Africa?
That's a great question. I think that as you may or may not know, the history of Namibia and its relationship to South Africa. South Africa also acted as colonizers to Namibia during the apartheid period. I'm sure many of you know what happened between 1903 and 1906. Our African Holocaust, with our Southern African Holocaust, with so many millions of Nama and Herero people that were killed by the German Second Reich. So now we are in a very different situation, post-1994, where the ANC government has made all kinds of initiatives to basically restore a relationship with neighboring African countries. And I know that Namibia is definitely one of those countries where Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, who in some way were considered colonies of South Africa. So those initiatives have definitely been on the agenda for at least 20 years. I will certainly try and find more specific documentation for you. I know this as a fact, for a fact, because 4 years ago, there was a group of people who met here in Durban, some of whom I met, and they came from the Namibian government, where they have a president and a prime minister. So I will try and send you that information. Your question is very important because it is long time overdue that South Africa has a much more equitable and cordial relationship with the neighbors, instead of continuing that tradition of also acting like a colonizer to neighboring Southern African countries. So whatever information I can find on your question in particular, I will send to Christoph more directly with documentation. I'll also send copies of all of the information that I have, including a copy of the charter and the South African Food Sovereign Campaign. So yes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank that you mentioned that already, that we are compiling a reader, which is not only consisting of the presentations, but also from additional material, which we will add to the reader. And then I think you will have a kind of a manual or a handbook, which leads you to different aspects of the topic. And I think we will be able to send it to you by the beginning of the next year, in mid of January. And many thanks again, Rozena. I think you leave a really impressed audience, how I see the reactions of our folks here.